The night was unnaturally still. Somewhere beyond the low hills, a faint red glow pulsed against the horizon, not the warm glow of hearth fires, but the smoldering breath of an army on the march. The moon hid behind thick clouds, as if unwilling to witness what was about to unfold. In the small frontier village of Veyrun, life had always been simple, wheat fields rippling in the summer wind, children chasing goats through the dusty lanes, and a single bell in the chapel tower that marked the rhythm of the day. But now, that same bell hung silent, as if holding its breath with the rest of the village. Veyrun lay in a borderland that had been fought over for centuries, a narrow valley cradled between two mountain ranges, its soil fertile and its river crossing one of the few natural routes for armies moving between empires. Traders had long known it as a resting place on the Silk Road of the West, but generals knew it for another reason. Whoever held Veyrun could move troops swiftly through the valley without being bottled up by the mountains. And tonight, the valley's fate rested in the path of Karzak the Unyielding, a warlord whose banner had become the shadow over half the known world. His name was already a curse in markets and monasteries alike. Towns that had dared to resist him were razed, their names struck from maps. Others, too fearful to fight, surrendered before his armies even arrived. Karzak's campaign had swept through the southern provinces in less than a season. Each victory had fed his legend, the cavalry charges that broke city walls like waves over sand, the night raids that left fortresses in smoking ruin. By the time rumors reached Veyrun, they had grown into monstrous tales of an army that marched without rest, soldiers who felt no pain, and siege engines taller than the tallest pine. Karzak's strength lay not just in his numbers, but in the psychology of fear. He understood that breaking a man's will was more efficient than breaking his shield. His advance scouts spread rumors days before his arrival, inflating the size of his army, exaggerating his cruelty, ensuring that terror arrived well before his banners. Villages often fled at the mere sound of his drums. Yet Karzak was also a strategist. He knew when to strike swiftly and when to bleed an enemy into submission. His supply lines were precise, his officers disciplined, his spies well-placed. To him, Veyrun was not a prize in itself, but a stepping stone to the northern kingdom's heartlands. The night before his arrival, his vanguard had already reached the hills outside the valley. The village's few scouts, shepherds turned sentries, reported the flicker of torches moving like rivers of fire across the slopes. If Veyrun could be said to have walls, they were nothing like the high stone fortifications of great cities. They were waist-high barricades of timber and stacked carts, hastily reinforced with stones and earth. The villagers had worked for days, their hands blistered, pulling plows and wagons into defensive lines. Inside those makeshift walls, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken questions. Would help come from the northern lords? Could they hold long enough for reinforcements? Or was this the last night they would sleep under their own roofs? In the old meeting hall, a circle of men and women sat around a long table lit by oil lamps. At its head was Captain Eldrin, a grizzled veteran who had once fought in the king's army but had returned home to farm. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight of command. "Tomorrow," Eldrin said, tracing lines in the dust with his finger, "they will come. Not all at once. They will test us first. They will think we are weak. That, we will use against them." Beside him, Mara, the village blacksmith, tightened her grip on a hammer as if it were a sword. Across from her, Father Orin, the aging priest, whispered prayers under his breath, more for courage than salvation. Around them sat farmers, millers, and shepherds, none soldiers, yet all willing to fight. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of smoke. Somewhere on the ridge, Karzak's soldiers were likely preparing their camps, boiling water for rations, checking their weapons, sharpening blades for a battle they expected to be brief. In Veyrun, preparations were quieter, more desperate. Mothers tucked children into hidden cellars. The old and infirm were moved to the chapel's underground crypt. The blacksmith's forge burned late into the night, fashioning spearheads from broken plowshares. Above the village, on the watchtower's creaking platform, young Tomas kept his eyes on the hills. He was barely 16, his hands trembling around the shaft of a borrowed spear. He thought of the stories told by travelers, that Karzak never spared a settlement that resisted. And yet, he also remembered something his father had once said: a man is not measured by the size of the enemy, but by whether he stands at all. Midnight passed. A thin drizzle began to fall, hissing softly against the thatched roofs. Somewhere out in the darkness, a horn sounded, long, low, and unmistakable. The first signal from the Conqueror's scouts. Captain Eldrin lifted his head from the map. "They're here," he said quietly. In that moment, the villagers of Veyron understood that the coming hours would decide everything: their homes, their families, their very place in history. And though the weight of fear pressed down on every heart, a strange resolve began to rise as well. For while armies may burn cities and erase names from maps, sometimes history remembers the night when the smallest stood their ground. Fade to black. The sound of distant drums rolling in like thunder. The valley was not yet awake when Karzak's army began to move. From the ridgelines, the glow of countless campfires faded into the pale gray of dawn. The drizzle from the night before had left the ground slick, and the rhythmic pounding of boots and hooves turned the soil into a churned black paste. Karzak rode at the center of the column, a towering figure clad in lacquered lamellar armor, the crimson crest of his helm visible even through the morning mist. His warhorse, a massive black destrier named Ashfong, snorted clouds into the cold air. Around him marched the core of his elite guard, veterans from campaigns in the east, their armor dented but polished, banners snapping in the wind. For those who had never seen him, Karzak's presence alone was enough to explain his reputation. He was a conqueror who mixed ruthlessness with calculated patience. In the last 5 years, his forces had captured 13 walled cities, forced 3 rival lords into vassalage, and shattered 2 standing armies in open battle. He commanded not merely soldiers but disciples of war, men and women who believed that following him would lead them to immortality through glory. His strategies were as much psychological as they were tactical. Villages in his path were often given a choice: surrender immediately or face the fate of those who resisted. Most capitulated before his siege engines ever rolled into view. The sheer speed of his marches, the precision of his attacks, and the merciless efficiency with which he punished defiance had made him seem unstoppable. Veyron was, on parchment, an insignificant mark, a cluster of homes, a few dozen families, and no real fortifications. But on Karzak's campaign map, it was a vital crossing point. The narrow pass behind the village cut days off the journey north, allowing an army to bypass the heavily fortified River Halden Bridge. Securing it meant an unbroken corridor into the enemy's agricultural heartland. Word had reached Karzak's officers that the villagers had not fled. That was unusual. His spies had reported makeshift defenses, sentries on the ridge, and fires burning late into the night. It was not the behavior of a people resigned to surrender. "Stubborn fools," muttered General Varnek, one of Karzak's most trusted lieutenants. "We'll break them before midday." Karzak did not answer. His dark eyes remained fixed on the fog ahead. He had learned long ago never to underestimate a cornered foe. Yet he could not believe that a hamlet of farmers and herders could present any real obstacle. The army advanced in 3 divisions, light cavalry scouts sweeping the flanks, infantry columns in the center, and a rear guard pulling supply carts laden with rations, spare weapons, and bundles of siege ladders. The drums began, deep, measured beats that echoed through the valley. The sound was deliberate, designed to announce the army's presence long before the first spear was thrown. It was part of Karzak's theater of war, a ritual that sapped the will of his enemies. From the slope above, young Tomas, the same boy who had stood watch through the night, spotted the first ranks emerging from the mist. They seemed endless. Armor caught the dim light, spears rose like a forest of iron, and banners embroidered with the black hawk of Karzak's house rippled in the wind. In the village below, the defenders heard the drums and froze for a heartbeat. The sound was both alien and primal, a noise that carried the weight of all who had fallen to it before. Captain Eldrin's voice cut through the silence. "Hold your positions. They have numbers, but they bleed like we do. By mid-morning, the vanguard had reached bowshot of the village. Karzak signaled for a probing attack, 100 light infantry to advance and test the defenders' mettle. Arrows arced from the village, clattering against shields. The attackers pressed closer, but as they reached the first barricade, one of them stumbled. Beneath his foot, a crude pit trap collapsed, sending him and two others into a bed of sharpened stakes. The sudden cries carried across the field. Karzak's eyes narrowed. Traps. For a moment, he almost smiled. They've prepared, he murmured to Varnek. Good. To Karzak, resistance meant the chance to make an example, a lesson to all watching from the north. But to the villagers, this was the first sign that their preparations might buy them more than just a few hours. The fog began to lift, revealing the full scale of the army. The defenders could see for the first time just how badly they were outnumbered. And yet, no one broke ranks. By noon, the standoff had begun. The Conqueror's army waited to strike in earnest. The villagers waited to survive the day. The fog had barely lifted when the villagers gathered in the main square for what might be the last time. Every face was marked by the same expression, not the wild panic of the unready, but the steady grimness of those who had chosen their path and would see it through. Veyron had always been a place of wooden fences and open doors. Now, every lane had become a choke point, every barn a barricade. Wagons were overturned and stacked with sandbags. The mill's great grinding stones had been rolled into the road to block cavalry. Even the chapel's doors were reinforced with timber crossbeams. Children too young to fight carried buckets of water to the rooftops, where clay pots filled with sand and oil waited, crude fire traps for the first attackers to breach the lines. Women who had never lifted more than a cooking knife now carried spears tipped with repurposed scythe blades. At the forge, Mara's hammer rang out like a heartbeat. Sparks danced in the dim light as she quenched the latest batch of spearheads. Her arms were blackened with soot, her braid tied back tight. To anyone watching, she was the embodiment of the village's transformation, no longer just a smith, but an armor-maker for war. Inside the meeting hall, Captain Eldrin spread a hand-drawn map across the table. Around him stood a dozen men and women, farmers, trappers, hunters, now commanders of their own tiny squads. They'll come from the east, Eldrin said, tapping the map. Straight through the fields. We'll give them the illusion of weakness here, he marked a thin barricade, and when they break through, we hit them from both flanks. Old Herrick, the village trapper, grinned through his missing teeth. I've laid snares where their horses will try to cut around. Nothing'll get a cavalry charge like a broken leg. Father Oren, standing quietly in the corner, finally spoke. And if they breach every defense? Eldrin's gaze swept the room. Then we fight in the streets. Every door, every window. They will pay for every step. No one argued. They all knew there would be no retreat. That afternoon, the villagers moved with purpose. Arrows were counted and divided. Stones were stacked along the rooftops. The shepherds released their flocks into the hills to keep them from the slaughter. Tomas stood watch again, scanning the horizon. His spear felt less heavy in his hands now. In his pocket, he carried a strip of leather from his father's old bridle, a talisman he swore would bring him luck. Mara passed by and handed him a fresh spearhead. Keep it sharp, she said, without looking back. Somewhere in the distance, the drums of Karzak's army beat again, slow and patient. They were not in a hurry. They wanted the defenders to feel the weight of hours passing, to know that the storm was coming and could not be stopped. By sunset, the village was ready, or as ready as it could ever be. Fires were lit in the watchtowers. Scouts reported the enemy encamped just beyond bowshot, their torches like a ring of fire encircling the valley. In the stillness before nightfall, the people of Veyron waited. They waited for the signal that would change their lives forever. And somewhere in the shadows, Captain Eldrin allowed himself the smallest thought. Perhaps, just perhaps, they've underestimated us. The first attack came just after nightfall. The villagers had expected Karzak to wait until morning, but the Conqueror knew the power of surprise. From the darkness beyond the fields came the shrill blast of horns, followed by the thunder of boots and hooves. Tomas saw them first, dark shapes breaking from the mist, shields raised, spears angled forward. The torches they carried lit their armor in flickering gold, turning them into a moving wall of fire. Captain Eldrin's voice cut through the night. "Archers! Now!" A volley of arrows hissed through the air, striking shields and mail with sharp metallic cracks. Several attackers fell, their cries lost in the roar of advancing troops. The first wave crashed into the outer barricades with brutal force, but the defenders held. Wooden shields slammed against wooden walls. Spears jabbed over the top. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and sweat. Then a shout from the left flank, one of the attackers had found a gap. But when they pushed through, they triggered Herrick's snares. Horses screamed as legs tangled in hidden rope and steel. Men tumbled into pits lined with sharpened stakes. The first wave faltered. From his vantage point on the ridge, Karzak watched without expression. He did not send his full force, not yet. This was a test, a way to read the defenders' strength, their weapons, their willingness to kill. "Interesting," he muttered to General Varnek. "They fight like soldiers, not farmers." Varnek shifted uneasily. "They'll tire before long." "Perhaps," Karzak said. "But they've made it clear this will not be a simple march." An hour later, the second assault began. This time the attackers carried long ladders and battering rams. Drums beat faster now, matching the pace of the charging infantry. Mara stood at the north barricade, hammer in hand. When the first ladder hooked over the wall, she swung hard, sending the climbing soldier tumbling backward. To her right, Father Oren, robe hitched up, sword in hand, fought like a man half his age, his blade flashing in the torchlight. The battering ram slammed into the east gate again and again, each impact rattling the entire barricade. Tomas, stationed above, hurled down a clay pot of oil. When the ram came again, another defender loosed a flaming arrow. In seconds, the ram was ablaze, its crew scattering under the sudden heat. Cheers erupted from the wall. But the victory was short-lived. In the chaos, a group of Karzak soldiers breached the south barricade, cutting down two defenders before anyone could react. For a heartbeat, panic rippled through the line. Eldrin was there in an instant, his sword a blur, his voice booming above the noise. "Hold the gap! Hold!" The villagers rallied. Mara abandoned her post to join the fight, striking one enemy so hard his helmet dented inward. Tomas thrust his spear into another, the shock of the kill freezing him for only a second before instinct forced him to keep moving. The breach was sealed, but at a cost. 3 more defenders lay dead. As midnight approached, Karzak called off the attack. The order was unexpected, his soldiers were trained to press until total collapse. But he had seen enough. He would let fatigue and fear work on the villagers through the long hours before dawn. From the barricades, the defenders watched the enemy pull back, their silhouettes melting into the mist. The field between them was littered with bodies, friend and foe alike. Captain Eldrin exhaled, his grip still white-knuckled around his sword. "They'll come harder at first light," he said. In the dark beyond the walls, Karzak mounted Ashfong and turned to Varnek. "Tomorrow," he said, "we break them." The drums fell silent. Only the distant sound of the river remained, flowing through a valley where life and death now balanced on the edge of a blade. Dawn came, gray and cold. The mist clung low over the fields, curling around the fallen as if trying to hide the night's brutality. From the barricades, the defenders could see the enemy camp stirring, silhouettes moving among rows of tents, the glint of spear points catching the weak morning light. Karzak had not withdrawn far. His army was still coiled around the village, ready to strike. The silence between the two forces was heavy, broken only by the cawing of crows already circling the battlefield. The final assault begins when the drums started again. They were faster than before. The ground seemed to vibrate under the synchronized march of hundreds of soldiers. Karzak had abandoned the probing strikes of the previous night. This was a full-force attack. From three sides, the army advanced, infantry in tight formation flanked by cavalry on the edges. Siege ladders and fresh rams rolled forward, their crews shielded by a wall of raised pavises. The defenders met them with everything they had left. Arrows rained down, stones crashed into helmets, and boiling oil splashed across the front ranks. But the sheer weight of numbers began to tell. The north barricade shuddered under the relentless blows of a ram. On the west side, two ladders went up at once, spilling enemy soldiers onto the walkway. The desperate gambit Captain Eldrin knew they could not hold every breach. He made a gamble, pulling most of the fighters to the north, where the main gate was close to giving way. At the same time, he ordered Herrick and a handful of hunters to slip out through a hidden cattle path in the rear. Their mission: strike at the enemy's supply carts. It was a plan born of desperation. If the supplies burned, the invaders would lose their food and siege materials, forcing them to retreat or risk starvation in hostile territory. While the battle raged at the walls, Herrick's group crawled through the wet grass beyond the enemy's flank. By sheer luck and the cover of mist, they reached the carts unnoticed. In minutes, torches set dry hay and pitch barrels ablaze. When the fire reached the first cart of arrows, the explosion ripped through the camp. The enemy falters. The sudden flames threw Karzak's ranks into confusion. Officers shouted conflicting orders. Some soldiers turned back to protect the supplies, others pushed forward toward the barricades. The cohesion that had been his army's hallmark began to fray. Eldrin saw the hesitation ripple through the enemy and shouted, "Push them back." The defenders surged forward in a counterattack, striking before the enemy could reorganize. On the ridge, Karzak watched the smoke rise from his supply line. His jaw tightened. He could press the attack and risk running his men hungry, or withdraw to regroup. Either choice meant a blow to his aura of inevitability. For the first time in years, Karzak chose retreat. Aftermath of the stand: as the drums signaled withdrawal, the defenders collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to cheer. The fields were littered with the dead, but the village still stood. Karzak's army melted back into the hills, its legend dented, its commander silent. Veyron had survived the storm. The morning after the retreat, the valley was eerily quiet. The enemy camp was gone, leaving only the deep impressions of countless boots and hooves pressed into the wet earth. Smoke from the burned supply carts still hung in the air, mingling with the smell of blood and damp soil. In the center of Veyron, survivors gathered in the square. There were no victory shouts, no grand celebrations, only weary faces and the unspoken knowledge of what had been lost. 22 villagers had fallen in the fighting. Their bodies were laid side by side beneath woolen blankets, and the chapel bell tolled once for each of them. The Conqueror's wound far from the village, Karzak's army moved north in silence. The retreat had been orderly, but every soldier knew the truth: they had been turned back. A nameless village had resisted the unyielding and survived. The wound was not one of numbers, his forces remained formidable, but of reputation. In the courts of rival lords, whispers began to spread: perhaps Karzak was not invincible after all. For the people of Veyron, this was more than survival. It was proof that the greatest power could be resisted by those who refused to yield. In the weeks that followed, merchants and travelers carried the tale far beyond the valley. Each retelling grew a little more dramatic, the traps more elaborate, the defenders more numerous, the fire brighter, until the story became part legend, part truth. Legacy of the stand: years later, bards sang of the night of fire and steel in the courts of kings. Military scholars cited it as a case study in asymmetric defense, how terrain, preparation, and morale could overcome overwhelming odds. Parents told their children the story not for its bloodshed, but for its lesson, that even the smallest can shape the course of history. The people of Veyron rebuilt slowly. Barricades were taken down, fields replanted, and the rhythm of daily life returned. Yet the memory of those days lived on in every stone, every path, every scar borne by those who had stood on the barricades. A final reflection standing on the ridge years later, Captain Eldrin, older now, with silver in his hair, looked out over the valley and thought of the night the Conqueror had come, and of the morning he had left. History, he knew, would remember Karzak for his empire. But here, in this small place, they would remember the night they stopped him. And in that truth lay the quiet power of Veyron's legacy, a reminder that sometimes the smallest stand is the one the world never forgets.